This is Emerging Sustainably, a podcast series exploring the broadening focus on sustainability and its impact on local governments in Victoria. Welcome to episode 2 of our 3-part podcast series, Emerging Sustainably. In this episode, 2019 Emerging Leaders Program participants talk with Zaytuna and Alyssa from the Victorian Student Representative Council. Completing the panel are Guy Pritchard, Climate Change Manager at Sustainability Victoria, and Brad Kelstrashone, Sustainability Officer at South Gippsland Council. Christian Thomas begins the session.
My name is Christian Thomas. I work for Baw Baw Shire Council. My role in my normal day job is working in information management, so I look after council's records, archives, information systems, stuff like that. It's a very different space to sustainability. It's something that's been very interesting to learn about.
My name's Guy Pritchard. I'm the Manager of Climate Change Coordination at Sustainability Victoria, state government organisation, not local government, but I have previously worked for local government as a Manager of Environment there.
My name's Brad Kelstrashone. I'm the Sustainability Officer at South Gippsland Shire. South Gippsland's relatively small in population, but reasonably large in size rural municipality in about 2 hours or so south-east of Melbourne. My role's mainly around energy projects and climate change. So although my title is Sustainability Officer, we also have a Biodiversity Officer and a waste team who look after that side of things. So my expertise and interest is really in the energy space and climate change as well. Yeah.
My name is Alyssa. I was a Year 12 student at Bendigo Senior Secondary College. I'm now graduated, thank goodness. And I was an executive of the Victorian Student Representative Council. And in terms of what I've been involved in environment and sustainability, I am a member of the Bendigo Youth Council, and I was also a member of the Sustainability and Environment Advisory Committee of the council as well.
I'm also a recent graduate of Year 12. My name is Zaytuna. I also was a Vic SRC executive of the previous year. Yeah, and I'm really interested in climate change. I believe it's an emergent issue and it's urgent. And I'm very interested about the conversation we're going to have.
My name's Jess Bailey. I'm from Yarra Ranges Council. I'm part of the LGPro Emerging Leaders program, working across the whole of the Victorian local government sector and learning how we can better work together with our community to meet your needs. But also my role daily is in facilities management. So I'm managing council buildings, working with our sustainability team around implementing more efficient running of aquatic centres, sports and leisure centres, installing solar panels, water tanks, and then what happens once they get installed, and are they actually reducing our emissions and our footprint, and are we looking after them, and what can we learn and what can we share?
I'm interested to hear your opinions on youth getting involved in the council, and would you be prepared to have a younger person on your council?
I'll answer from a state government perspective and maybe from a sustainability perspective as well. It's critical the youth voice is in sustainability. I mean, that's the whole point, is it's a long-term intergenerational type thinking that we definitely need to have that youth voice in. And from any government's perspective, I think there needs to be a youth voice, whether it's local government or state government or even federal government. That youth voice should be there. And as I reiterate again, especially from sustainability points of view. Because I think the whole notion of sustainability is long-term. It's not short-term thinking, especially when you think about climate change and what's happening now, is the climate change is locked in. It's going to happen. It doesn't matter what we do now, it's not going to stop the change that's already occurred, I suppose. So the challenge for our generation is to slow it down, the next generation to stop it, and the generation afterwards to actually ameliorate it. But you're looking cross-generational. So I think from that perspective, sustainability is absolutely cross-generational, and that's why it needs the engagement of young people now, because it's their future that really is going to bear the brunt of it. Unfortunately, not mine. Hopefully I'm around long enough to see through some of the changes that are going to be positive, but it's that intergenerational stuff that we need to be thinking about. And I suppose the Indigenous type ideas of you're conserving the land for future generation have got to come back through.
I'd be interested to hear from our young leaders and our future leaders around what your thoughts are on whether it be an Indigenous perspective around sustainability or just your own perspective that you might like to give us some insights. Do you feel hopeful?
Yeah, I mean, I personally feel very hopeful. I think at the moment we're in a really special moment in history where younger people and well, all people are really working together to try and solve this climate change crisis. Well, not solve it, but slow it down. I guess my question for all of you, I think a lot of the time, well, personally in my experience being involved in local government, a lot of the time young people are often treated very symbolically, in the sense that sometimes we are sort of put on councils or put on reference groups just as a tick box sort of thing. And I think a lot of the time a big barrier for us being involved in council is the language and the policies. You know, it's very complex, there's a lot of jargon. So my question is, how do you think councils can work to try and solve that issue?
Jesse, use the term Indigenous sustainability. Can you maybe explain what that is for people who might not have heard that term before?
I guess the first Australians of this country are the Indigenous people and are the Aboriginal people, and we've also got our Torres Strait Islander people, and we've got traditional owner people who are locals to their own patches of land all over the country, and we've got Indigenous people that are all of the first Australians in Australia. And I think if we're looking at sustainability from that kind of lens, or if we're looking at representing diverse communities, we can look at it from that perspective too. And diverse communities might have other cultures within them that also have an Indigenous perspective from a different country, because Indigenous means native to your country. I guess that connection to land management, connection to self, connection to spirituality, connection to place has a lot of parallels and links with the way that community can understand sustainability. So that's why I was making that link, and it's probably why Guy brought it up.
It was why I brought it up, especially in terms of local government. That connection to place is really strong for those communities. So that's where they belong, if you like. And I think local government is ideally placed to pick up on that. A lot harder for state government or even federal government to do that. But that sort of community in place is actually a really strong concept to do that. Picking up on your point too about that integration type thing, I think that is one of the reasons why as well that it's hard to break in, because you're trying to break into a system which is very siloed, and you're trying to introduce a new voice into it, but they've got the processes and systems established and are very strong because they're focused on one aim quite often. We were talking about the SDG, the Sustainable Development Goals, and the need to integrate, and I think that's a big challenge that still needs to happen. There isn't the avenue for a lot of different voices in those spots yet, but that's something that definitely needs to happen. As Jess said, yeah, that's why we need to try and get that in there.
Are there any groups with a focus around sustainability?
There are programs run by state government, definitely, that have a focus on sustainability. The Take Two Pledge program, the Climate Change Pledge program, which asks local government or business, individuals, schools or community organisations to pledge to join the state government in the pathway to zero carbon emissions by 2050. So that's a voluntary pledge program that came out of the Paris Agreement a few years ago now, and it is a legislated target for the state government, the zero emissions by 2050. So Take Two is one of the programs that does that, and as I said, there is a large council involvement in that.
South Gippsland Shire Council actually has pledged, is part of Take Two. So yes, we're pledges to the Sustainability Victoria's Take Two goals. In our area, we've also got the Gippsland Climate Change Network, which is there's a number of council greenhouse alliances that are really focused on greenhouse action for councils, and they're based in regional areas and urban areas. So there's the Northern Alliance, is the inner city northern councils, and then there's also regional ones. We don't have a greenhouse alliance of councils as such, but we have the Gippsland Climate Change Network, which has councils and businesses and individuals as members. So it's a little bit different to the greenhouse alliances. We are not currently members of the GCCN, the Climate Change Network, but we have been in the past, and we certainly still work with them, and we attend their events and we support them in a range of things, but we're not currently members as such. We're looking to join another group, which is the Cities for Climate Protection. We haven't actually joined them yet, but they're a bit of a pledge-based group. So it's a bit similar to Take Two in that you pledge actions that you're going to take, but they also then link you up with similar councils. They pair you up and look at your demographics and your geography and socioeconomic status and so forth, and try to pair you up with other councils and share knowledge across those councils about things that similar councils are doing and support you in achieving your goals. So at the moment that's sitting with our executive about membership of that group, so hopefully we'll be able to tick that one too and get on board.
Recently, there has been a move for a lot of councils to declare a climate emergency, especially from the school strikes for climate change. Do you think that this is an effective method in terms of combating climate change? What do you think councils should do in relation to this?
I'll speak, I suppose, broadly. We're right in the middle of considering it right at present. So we had a group come to council and requested that it wasn't a petition as such, but it was a group putting in a request to change council's strategic plan to declare a climate emergency. And council went away and considered it and came back and said, we will request a briefing from the sustainability team on what the implications are and what it means to declare a climate emergency. So, which is my job to then produce the briefing, which I have done, and the position of council is still a bit up in the air. I sort of went backwards and forwards in writing the briefing. If we are going to declare a climate emergency, is there any point doing it unless we're really going to treat this like an emergency? And actually that means changing everything, changing the way we do everything. And that, to me, declaring an emergency in many ways means we actually have to recognise the problem for what it is and change absolutely everything that we do right from day dot. And that would require quite a bit of big changes, obviously, but quite a bit of funds to support those changes, which we have to be realistic about whether we can achieve it. So, but then there's another argument. There's quite a bit of symbolic power in declaring the climate emergency. There's a lot of belief that the declaration of a climate emergency enables you to then advocate across to other neighbouring councils, advocate up to state government and up to the federal government for similar declarations and potentially some funds to come down, because we get a significant amount of funding from the state government for a number of programs that we do. So the declaration in itself is a way of saying we think this is serious and we need to take more action. We may not be able to afford to do all the things that we should be doing. Please help us, because you're the ones holding the purse strings in many ways. So I think there's a lot of value in it. I do. I've sort of come to the position that I think even if you can't do everything, we do need to recognise the problem for what it is, even if we can't do everything immediately. But there's a lot of value in just sitting down and looking at everything that we do, our strategic plans, our business plans across all the different sectors, and making sure that we are considering climate change in every decision that we make. So that in itself doesn't necessarily have to cost much money. Perhaps you wouldn't go to the full extreme of overnight changing all the fleets to electric vehicles, and there's a number of things that we could do, but you certainly could start the process by just having that thinking at the highest level of all the strategic plans and documents and the strategies that the council develop. So I think there's value in that. And that doesn't have to come at a huge cost initially. And the advocacy value and the symbolism and the messaging from the declaration itself and the number of councils that are getting on board, I think is quite powerful in itself.
Great question, because it's not an easy one to answer. I don't think there is a yes or no answer to that it's a good thing or not. My perspective is the science tells us it's an emergency. We've got to act really, really quickly, but we need systemic change, and that's not an emergency response if you're looking at 10 years. So I think, for me, it doesn't matter whether you declare a climate emergency or not, it's the action we have to do now. There's no point declaring a climate emergency if your action is then, we'll have a plan by the end of next year. The messaging is not consistent then, and that's what I think. If you're going to declare a climate emergency, you have to move now. If you're not going to declare a climate emergency, the science is telling you still have to move now. Really tricky question, but it's a really good one to keep asking. Yeah.
If I can just jump in, I think it's a way of focusing minds within council. I went to a presentation just a couple of days ago, the South East Council Climate Change Alliance, SECA, SECCA. They ran a session for SECA councils and some Gippsland councils as well. So they're one of those greenhouse alliances I was speaking about, on the implications of declaring a climate emergency. And it started, they had a gentleman come along and start the session, and he gave a presentation on the latest climate science. And he said, look, I know I'm speaking to a room full of sustainability officers. Most of you probably know all of this stuff, but I think there's real value in focusing our minds when we're about to have this discussion by just reiterating what the science is telling us. And I read this stuff every day and I'm fully aware of it, but it was really powerful, and just sitting there listening to it all and then going, okay, now let's get on with the discussion. Just listening to that climate science, room full of people who know it inside out. But he said, I'm doing this as a way of focusing your mind. And I think a climate emergency declaration does the same thing. It focuses the mind of the people at council going, this is serious. So we need to come back to that point. And I think it helps create the actions that you're speaking about, Guy.
Well, I think a question leading on from what Guy said, I know you said that it's about taking action. So do you think that councils are taking adequate action? And if not, what can they do?
Some councils, a lot of councils are taking action. I think there's 20 or so who've declared a climate emergency now. Most councils, or a lot of councils, have climate change adaptation strategies and are also working on mitigation effects as well. Can you do more? Yes, absolutely. But it does need an integrated response again. So it's really hard for one council alone, and especially some of the poorer councils, to actually do that. So I 100% agree that there needs to be more support if we can get it through to councils to do that. But I think there's also probably more opportunities for each council to do more. That's across the board. Every level of government and individuals and business can do a lot more, and we need to do that. So where they can focus is understand where your emissions are, and it's different for different councils. Some of them, the urban councils obviously have a lot a different emissions profile from some of the rural ones, but you need to hit the ones where you have the highest impact first. So go for your best returns, because it is going to be a longish process. But across the next 10 years, get your highest emissions down first and then work on the harder to abate ones. So energy is the easiest one. Even though it doesn't sound like it, energy is actually the easiest emission sector to actually reduce your emissions by switching to renewables, energy efficiency and those sort of things, and then work on the non-energy emissions. So agriculture will be a very interesting one for rural councils, because that's not an easy to abate sector. But transport is also another one, which is going to have to be tackled pretty soon. Those are the two sectors that are going up, whereas energy emissions intensity is coming down. So, go for your highest impact, and it will depend on the council. Do you think so, Jess? Sorry. Yeah. I'm not quite sure if that's a council perspective. That's my perspective sitting where I do.
Yarra Ranges Council certainly had a carbon management program. I'm more in the maintenance space.
Yep.
After that's been implemented to try and reduce our emissions from our highest emitting facilities, which are our arts buildings and our aquatics facilities. So we've certainly taken that approach for a reason, but I'm also really mindful of empowering community and not just doing the things that reduce our emissions, but also things that make people feel like they can make a difference in their own communities. And I think that's where Yarra Ranges is moving next, around energy reduction and community solar building assets, or how they share those energy efficiency opportunities. But I don't think that's very well known or defined yet.
So what does that mean, Jess, when you're saying energy sharing?
Whether that's looking at the concept of microgrids, so whether instead of having, this is quite a bit outside of my area of expertise, but rather than having an energy market that's owned by energy providers, you have, I think, third world countries that have microgrids in there, so they have their own battery converters in their own little communities, and multiple houses have multiple batteries, and then those, and each community building or house or hut has their own panel, and they are responsible for generating their own power. And how can we learn from those communities? Can we bring that kind of thinking and locally owned energy generation to our local governments in Australia? I don't know the answer, but I think that's really exciting for empowering local people in what they can do at home.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of aspects. There's the council's own emissions from council's operations, and then there's the community emissions. And historically, councils, and certainly we're one of those, have concentrated on the emissions from our operations. And so we've got a greenhouse gas reduction plan to reduce our emissions by 10% by 2020 from 2010 levels. So it's a 10% reduction over a decade, which now is looking completely inadequate when you look at the latest climate science. We really need to ramp that up, but that was our target set a few years back. And we're on track to achieve that. We've done that through a lot of, like Guy mentioned, through building energy efficiency. We've put solar on a lot of our buildings. We've actually improved our fleet. We have council vehicles. We've got much more efficient vehicles. The big one was really a street lighting changeover. We went to LEDs from inefficient street lights, and that was a huge reduction, a huge step down. And from that, from the savings that we made, which was in the order of, I think it's sort of between $70,000 and $100,000 a year in electricity savings by changing over those light globes, we set up a revolving sustainability fund that can then fund future projects. So we took a chunk of those savings, put it aside, quarantined it, so we don't have to keep going each year to a budget process and ask for that money. That money's there every year, and then we use that to put solar on other buildings and implement other energy efficiency projects. So that's council's operations. The big one for us is, and any council that manages a landfill, is that the methane emissions from landfill completely swamp pretty much all the rest of your emissions combined. And it's a tricky one because landfills are something that, although they, according to greenhouse gas reporting protocols, they are council emissions. If you own the landfill, then you've got to wear the emissions, not the people who generate the actual waste and dump it at your landfill. So they register on our emissions profile, but they're, I don't know what the percentage is, but it's well over 80% of our emissions is our landfill. And we have a limited ability to control what people are putting in their rubbish. If they were composting at home, those emissions would be so it's organic material going into landfill that then decomposes anaerobically and turns into methane and goes into the atmosphere that's really damaging. So it's the area, just like the rest of community emissions, that we have relatively little control over. The stuff that we can control, we're doing pretty well at. The landfill stuff, a lot harder. What we can do in the landfill space, and we're looking at with our next contract, is to implement food and other organics recycling. So have a third bin, or for some councils it would be a fourth bin. Some already have green collection for garden, scraps and things, but not for their kitchen. So Bass Coast, a neighbouring council to ours, have introduced this system where they've got an extra bin. You can put all your green, any organics, kitchen organics. You can even put, I think you can put meat products in there as well, and so it all goes in there. Instead of it going to landfill, it's then composted and turned into commercial compost to be spread on farms. So that's completely reduces the emissions from their landfill. So that's a huge thing you can do, because landfill emissions are a big problem. The issue is they're a legacy emission. We're still going to have those, even if we stopped organics going into our landfills now, we're going to have methane coming out of those for some years to come. But we are trying to address that too by capping our landfill and capturing the gas and flaring it. So, getting back to the point that there's the council's emissions we can control, the community emissions is another thing, and we're just starting to look into that space now and trying to work out what are our community emissions. We know really well what our council emissions are, and we know how we can manage those. The community emissions is another whole area that a little bit less is known about, but a lot of work needs to be done on.
And what do you think are some of the easiest and most affordable ways that the community, as individuals, can positively affect their household's sustainability?
Easiest way is there are 4 pillars in sort of the climate change framework that point to where you should go first. First one is energy efficiency. So do all the simple stuff really well first. So make sure you're trying to reduce as much electricity as you're using. Then switch it to renewable energy, so solar panels, those sorts of things. And there are grants out there now that can cover the majority of the cost of solar panels through Solar Victoria and things like that. So switching to renewable energy as an individual is a good way to do it. And then, as you were saying, things like composting, the sort of non-energy use things, but definitely composting and those sorts of things, making sure that those recycling systems in place is probably the simplest and easiest things for individuals to do. And then you can join things like the community-owned renewable energy groups and get involved in those sort of local groups as well. We've run a few programs on retrofitting houses as well. So one of the energy efficiency things people can do is just to make sure their houses are thermally efficient in terms of block up the cracks, seal your house so that it doesn't leak heat when you need it to be warm, or doesn't let heat in when you need it to be cool. So you can reduce your air conditioning costs, whether it's heating or cooling, those sorts of things. The good thing about all that stuff is it saves you money as well. And some of the simple ones, the payback periods are really good. So make your house a lot more thermal efficient. And then we also know from other programs you're running in a Healthy Homes program, if you do that, your health actually is better as well. So we were talking about the integrated outcomes before. If you have a thermally efficient house, you usually have better health outcomes and those sorts of things as well. So do the simple things at an individual level and then get involved at a community level, I think, is the easiest one. Just picking up on your point about community-owned energy and things and microgrids, and there are microgrids running in Australia. There's a trial out your way, out near Yarra Ranges, and one in the inner city. And there's also other community-owned renewable energy groups going around. Hepburn Wind was one of the first ones, but there are other groups popping up all over the state who are looking at what can we do to get to zero carbon emissions, and community-owned energy is one. And the really good thing about renewable energy, like solar and wind, is it's distributed. You don't need a massive centralised generation. It's distributed and it's scalable. You can put solar panels on your roof, or you can make a big solar farm for a small community, or you can make an even bigger one into generation. So renewable energy actually, one of the benefits of renewable energy is it's carbon free, but the other benefit is it's scalable, distributed, And the cost of producing it, once you've got it established, the cost of producing energy is pretty close to zero. So it'll unlock a huge amount of economic potential. So I think it's really exciting if you think about community-owned energy in that way. We can take that ownership back, and it's, what's the term, energy democracy? You're putting the power back in the hands of the local communities because they can own their own energy. And they're good examples overseas. I think Samso in Denmark is an island which completely community-owned their energy now. And it's all renewable, completely carbon-free. So it's possible. We know technically all this stuff's possible. It needs somebody to mobilise and activate the communities to do it. And that probably won't be government. It'll probably be community members who do that, who've got the passion and the drive to actually get there.
So just on that, Guy, do you see the main driver for that progress on that sort of space not being government, being the community as a whole, collective individual or groups of individuals coming together and making those changes similar to those energy groups?
Yeah, I think local government's got a key role in facilitating that. Hepburn, I mentioned before, the Hepburn Zero Net project, it was community driven, but Hepburn Shire was a very big supporter of that. And local governments are a key part of that community, but it needs that cross-community approach. Local government is absolutely a key part, but they don't have to be the driver. So Hepburn was a great example. Bendigo City Council are another council who are pushing for more zero net carbon things. So definitely the influence of community voices in those spaces helps, yeah. And down your way too, Brad.
Yeah, I just wanted to throw in a bit of a counterpoint if I could.
Yeah.
I think community's ripe for community energy projects, and I think there's a lot of people out there who are pushing for them. There are actually some real barriers to microgrids and things like that, and they're regulatory barriers, and they've been in place for a long time, and there's been a large number of people who've been banging on about trying to fix these things for a long time, and there's been a lot of resistance. So I think there is a role for governments because the energy market is managed by COAG, the Council of Australian Governments. So state governments have to get together and change the rules to actually enable people to set up microgrids. At the moment, I can't generate electricity on my roof and sell it to my neighbour. And that's really the definition of a true microgrid. It's actually banned in the law. You cannot. I would have to be an energy retailer to be able to transfer electricity across a property boundary. So we can't at council. We've got buildings that are right next to each other. We've got one with a large roof and we've got another property right next door. It's on the same recreation reserve, but there's a property boundary between them, and we can't put a big chunk of solar on that roof and sell it across to that building there because it's crossing a property boundary, and therefore you're trading electricity across a boundary, and therefore you have to be an energy retailer. So there are regulatory barriers to these simple things that would actually unlock a heap of localised community-based energy.
Yeah, look, I 100% agree. I think I was saying that I don't think government's going to lead it, but government can enable it. Yep. They definitely need to act as well. So.
And how do you think they can enable it? Because you're talking about there's a barrier. So how, in terms of like that, how can they mobilise?
From a state government point of view, say it's a regulatory barrier, which it is known, and they're running trials for microgrids at the moment, but it needs to be addressed in that regulatory barrier as well. So it's putting pressure on to get that going quickly. But the pressure from the community is coming.
To be fair, Victoria is really trying to push the microgrid stuff. They provided a heap of money for microgrids, and they're doing a trial down in the Latrobe Valley as well, and which has been fantastic, but the barriers still exist at that. Well, it's an Australian level. It's kind of the federal government, but it's also the state governments, and it's the rule makers at that level. The AEMC, which is the Australian Energy Market Commission, are the people who make the rules for how the energy market works. And at the moment, it needs some real political pressure on them to change the rules because they've got a lot of pressure on them coming from the existing energy companies as well. And so they keep rejecting proposed rule changes that would enable a lot of these things. So I think we need to get those changes happening to unlock a heap of potential there.
So, Zaituna and Alyssa, I'm really interested to hear what your thoughts are when you hear about things like these regulatory problems and something that seems as simple as being able to transfer electricity across, even though it's a property boundary, really it's owned by the same entity at the end of the day. What do you think when you hear of that kind of barrier?
I guess it's a barrier that you don't really think about. When we think about making our communities more renewable, I think a lot of us disregard the legalities and the very nitty-gritty things that stop councils from entirely being more sustainable or entirely relying on renewable energy. And I think what you said about how these regulatory boundaries they're the key to unlocking so much. And so I think I understand the fact that you have to be an energy retailer to sell energy. I understand that completely, and I'm sure there are reasons why they're there. But at the same time, I think it's one small step that we can take to really unlocking a whole world of possibility for renewable energy in our communities.
It's really interesting because we talk about a barrier, but it's essentially invisible to us. But I think in terms of that, younger people, we don't really get the rationale behind it. It's like, just, it doesn't make sense. Like, why not share? I don't know. I feel like it's there in place to protect the private sector, basically, businesses in a sense.
The power provider,
Yeah.
energy retailers and things like that, yeah.
But then it's not there to protect us as a society in terms of climate change. It's very political in a sense. It's very like biased by profit and companies and the private sector, and it's hard for us to kind of gauge our place in this as younger people because we're often not the ones in the position to have power to sell.
Yeah. Just with the grid, I think it is a political question as well. There's no doubt that the existing companies would prefer it to stay the way it is. But there are also technical issues because we've got a grid that's hardwired that runs from sort of east to west, if you like, and it's hard for then people in the west to generate and force electricity back the other way. So there are technical issues, and there are technical issues about how much power you can get in and the stability of the grid. But they are all solvable, but they haven't solved them yet, and that requires large-scale infrastructure change, which requires a lot of money. So there are technical issues we have to solve. We know how to do them, but it will require time and money. But there are also that inertia of it's always been done this way and we want to retain the way we keep doing it. And that's something that will only change if people push hard enough to get it done. But there are technical issues as well, but I wouldn't say that they're going to hold it there forever because we do know the answers in the technical sphere. The challenge is to adapt. Technology is not the biggest barrier that's there. But yeah, I don't understand how the grid works at the moment either. It's something that was wired up, over 50, 60 years. But the other thing to think about too is that governance systems and government was probably formed in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and that probably needs to be a bit rewired as well. So that'll be a big challenge though.
Oh, well, in terms of mobilising the community, how can the local government best help the community to take positive action on their own sustainability?
Yeah, look, it's a tricky one. I think local government has a key role in educating the community about the sustainability challenges that confront the local community. Education comes best if it's come from a trusted source, and sometimes local governments aren't loved by their local community, and I think that's relatively universal. So although we have a role, we also have a challenge in that space. So we have a challenge of being a trusted source of information or a trustworthy actor in that space. So it is a challenge for local governments, I think. I think we've definitely got a role in doing things like delivering services that can reduce emissions, like I mentioned about the food and other organics, recycling. But in terms of another thing councils could certainly do, and it's something that we've looked at, is providing electric vehicle charging infrastructure, for example, because the transition to electric vehicles is very close, and one of the barriers is going to be range anxiety, which exists, even if it's not. I like to call it perceived range anxiety because I think a lot of people think there's an issue with range with electric vehicles, but the reality is if they actually map the amount of travel that they did in a day, they are rarely ever going to need to charge anywhere but home. I mean, every day you're leaving the house with a full tank of fuel effectively. However, that barrier, that perception exists, and while that perception exists, people are going to be reluctant to move across to electric vehicles. Cost issues aside, but I think they'll come down pretty quickly. So council's provision and other bodies' provision of electric vehicle charging infrastructure will help alleviate that concern and therefore enable people to shift over hopefully sooner. So I think that's something that a really positive action that councils can take.
And I think, supporting local community energy groups and things like that. I know council already do those sorts of things, so keeping on with that. We're running a community of practice program for zero carbon communities in transition. There's about 30 community groups all the way from someone like Totally Renewable Yakandanda, the Hepburn example, Totally Renewable Newstead. Mainly, interesting enough, in regional areas because they're clearly defined communities, I think. Phillip Island is also looking at going totally renewable energy. And I know councils do support those groups, but we've been looking at getting them together in a community of practice, and we have about 80 groups at the moment who have joined in that community of practice. And what we're trying to do is identify the common barriers across that. And one of the biggest ones is actually volunteer burnout, because a lot of these people are doing it on top of their normal jobs. So there are issues like that. I think from a state government point of view, we're looking at what are those key barriers, how might you support those groups doing that, because nobody gives grants for admin work. or stuff like that. But we're hearing back from the community that that's what's just grinding them down, is the continual administration type stuff, applying for grants, not getting them, they're putting their time through and all of that. So we're trying to look at what are those barriers, and then what are the next barriers they're going to hit. One was data. How do you know which is your biggest emissions? Where should you work as a community group? That sort of thing. So there are now some data tools out there that have been put together by Beyond Zero Emissions and Renew and ECLI, Ironbark. So there are a few of those sort of things that are coming through that will actually help make it a lot easier. And I think it's sort of the way your local government will approach many things, as well as state government. You should look at what are the barriers and then help them. And it's different for different groups. Urban areas, it's harder to engage the community in these issues. So we've been working with Moreland and some other councils on how do you engage a diverse community in climate change, because like South Gippsland, the communities are fairly well defined geographically, but in the city of Moreland, they define themselves very differently. So we're trying to look at those barriers. So I think there is a role for local government and state government. How do you support those community groups and their actions? Yeah.
In Yarra Ranges Council, some of the most exciting initiatives that have popped up at the local level are the plastic bag-free communities that have been initiated on lots of levels. Sometimes they've been developed by the community in their local area. Sometimes it's been municipal waste organisations, and sometimes it's been the state government through Sustainability Victoria that's engaged these groups. But it's really easy if the community are given bags and are shown how, and it's not stigmatised, and local businesses are also not economically at a disadvantage, so they're also given incentives to support communities to change these behaviours, because they're easy to do if everyone is enabled. So I think bringing your bag along has been something that's been really a big change in the Yarra Ranges only in the last 18 months. And I think that was off the back of state government legislative banning single-use plastic bag policy, which is really exciting. Local community gardens have been another fantastic way that's affordable, brings people together. It's fun. There can be community festivals, dances, pizza, cooking. That sense of place and pride and community connection is a really important way to positively affect households around sustainability initiatives. So I think we can talk about energy and barriers and policy, but I think at the local level it's also really important to look at how fun some of these things can actually be, to engage schools, to work around saving your local threatened species. It might be the platypus or the frog, or it might just be about buying something from your neighbour next door, or swapping produce with your neighbours who might have more sun than you, in my instance, but I might be able to give them some fertiliser for their garden from my chickens. So there's a range of different really exciting local sustainability initiatives that you can do to make a difference that don't have those legislative barriers as well.
I think as an individual, something that my household does, we just plant a lot of flowers so that there's heaps and heaps of bees in our garden, and it's really awesome because, bees are so incredibly important to our ecosystem, as I'm sure you all know, and they're becoming threatened. So I guess something easy that you can do is just to plant plants. Yeah. What does the local government believe the community expects of them in terms of sustainability?
As a younger person, I think it's just to act. I feel like a lot of us are not aware. There's that barrier of knowledge on what is your local government doing and how can I get involved. I think there's that disconnect between the youth and the community members in the council. So I think for us, it's just we want people to take action, and in doing that, have transparency, because often we're not really told, or there's that disconnect somehow. We expect the councils to take adequate action. I know for me, I've had an issue with recycling. I know that my council does not have an adequate management system in terms of paper recycling, because I know a lot of students have now finished school and have a lot of paper. I googled what contaminates paper and whatnot, and I have all this knowledge, and I want to do something about it, but there's a barrier. So I can't recycle this. I have to just put it in the yellow bin, or I have to go find a private company in order to recycle my paper. So that in itself is an action I want my council to take. I think it's unique to every council. Some councils are very progressive in terms of recycling and might have another area they need to improve on.
One of the biggest problems in terms of what we expect of our council is that a lot of people don't really know what our council does. When I first came to Bendigo, a lot of my friends were like, oh, they're the people that supply our waste management, or they collect taxes, they do the parking. But I think a lot of the time, again, that transparency between council and its citizens, it's lacking a lot in terms of that communication. And I think as well, people feel demobilized because it's a very formal process to get council's attention. So if you wanted council to act on something, you have to develop a proposal, you have to attend the meetings, and for a lot of people it's very daunting. So I think what you were saying, Zaytuna, about that barrier, both in terms of how legitimate it is in the sense that it's seen as something that is so hard to do, and also in terms of that language as well. Yeah.
Interesting to get your perspective, Brad, as a council officer. Yeah.
Well, I think it's an excellent question. I think you raised a really good point, Alyssa, about community not knowing what councils actually do. I think that's a real challenge for us. I think the community doesn't know what we are doing in terms of sustainability. So globally, around the world at the same time, over this 24-hour period, they were offering free talks by Al Gore-trained presenters on climate change. And so we hosted one of those, and just chatting to the people who came to that. And afterwards, one of the things that became pretty apparent was that people really don't think we're doing anything on climate change, and perhaps we're not very good at actually advertising or promoting what we do. So we're doing a whole bunch of things at the moment. And we've got a local Prom Area Climate Action group who are running a climate action picnic in one of our little towns, Fish Creek. So they're getting people together to sort of talk some of the positive messages about climate change and look at the things that are happening and the things that you can do, but also to try and mobilise people to take more action as well. So I'm going along to that with a couple of purposes. One is to try and let people know what we are actually already doing, but also to try and find out what do they expect of us. Because I don't really know what the community expects of us. And it's tricky too, because the community is quite diverse. South Gippsland is quite diverse. We've got people who are really strongly advocating for us to declare a climate emergency and to take significant action. But we also have a very traditional conservative community in South Gippsland, people who are even dubious about the science of climate change and don't think we should be doing anything. So it's not clear cut. And I think the question, what do the community expect of us, is a tricky one, because it depends on who you ask. I know I'll get a very clear message tomorrow because the people I'm speaking to will be of one opinion, but I also recognise that there's other perspectives there too. So,
what does the future local government or state government look like in regards to environmental sustainability? What do you expect it to look like?
Yeah, I expect that in the near future, local government will place sustainability as a huge priority. I think at the moment it's getting there, but it's not quite there, in the sense that a lot of councils might not necessarily place sustainability as their top priority. So I would love for that to happen. I think local governments have a lot of work to do in terms of diversifying their councils as well, in terms of age, in terms of people from different racial backgrounds, people with disability, things like that. I would just love local governments to shift towards a place where they're more connected with their community and know what they want and are able to deliver on those expectations.
I said it before and I'll say it again. I believe that the future of the community is to have a representative council of themselves, so the council members reflect that of the community. And I've also heard about the sense of valuing place, and I feel like if a community values something, they will look after it. So hopefully in the future we have a community that values the environment enough to make change. Earlier on in the conversation we were talking about how communities or like councils are very siloed and in their own separate spaces. Do you think having a universal framework in an approach to climate action would be beneficial? So like there's a foundation and there's an understanding of what all the councils are doing. Do you think that would be beneficial?
I think it'd be beneficial, but you do need localised action and it can look differently. I think we need a common goal and that will unify people. So one of the things we have been looking at is an approach called collective impact, and using that approach to try and say, if we're all focused on the same goal, it really doesn't matter how you get there, then that's fine. And what we should be able to do then is say, if you're going to do this bit, we'll do that bit. If you're going to do it this way, we can learn from you, those sorts of things. So we do need that sort of collective impact framework to actually work together to integrate those sorts of things. You can have some people working on EVs. There's no point duplicating that across the 79 different councils. and let another council take a different lead on something else. But we all do need to know what's going on to make that work right. So I 100% agree there needs to be a communication framework, but you can have people doing different things. I don't think you have to, because each community will define itself slightly differently. But I do think the key is that integration aspect. It really is that my future vision, if you like, for how sustainability works is that you can have lots of these distributed groups, but they're all networked, and IT will help us do that. But they all work on that sort of common goal. So sustainability should be in everything we do across any government department. It should be for facilities management, your parks and gardens, your fleet management. It should be a common goal across all of those, and then they should be able to build on what each other do. So sustainability truly is an integrated framework, but you need to celebrate the diversity as well. You can't have one size fits all type approach. And I reckon we can do that. And the way that the energy grid's going is distributed generation, which is all connected and networked. We should work in the same sort of way. And governance structures would be good to work that way too. But it might take till 2050 to get there. But then that's a challenge for your generation, really, isn't it? Or the next group coming up. So the future leaders have really got to pick that up and build that vision and take it where you guys want to go.
I think in the climate change space, councils are working pretty collaboratively together. Certainly I know locally, while we don't have a Greenhouse Alliance, we don't have a specific Greenhouse Alliance of our councils, the 6 Gippsland councils meet regularly to get together to talk about, and we have a regular agenda that's hosted by Sustainability Victoria, actually, a colleague of Guy's down our way, pulls us together and we sit down and we talk about shared issues in the sustainability area. We recently combined on a project, us and 3 other Gippsland Shires, combined to look at the feasibility of a solar farm in the local area to share electricity across the councils, to sell electricity to the councils. We combined on the electric vehicle study, looking at electric vehicle charging infrastructure across Gippsland. So that was all 6 Gippsland councils got together to look at that and to do a bit of a mapping exercise, because we figured there was no point us just looking at it ourselves. Electric vehicles are going to travel across municipal boundaries, so one council by themselves looking at it is a bit pointless. So we got the 6 Gippsland Shires together and looked at a mapping exercise and a delivery schedule, what would that look like. We looked at the planning barriers to electric vehicles, and out of that, separately but also coinciding with that, there's a now project being run by the Central Victorian Greenhouse Alliance, one of those Greenhouse Alliances I spoke about, and the Goulburn Broken Greenhouse Alliance, which are the 2 ones that sort of cover the northern and northwestern and northeastern area of the state, the rural councils in those areas. They're driving this project to look at the delivery and the shared ownership and the shared billing systems and things for electric vehicle charging infrastructure on behalf of a number of councils, and they put it out there to all these different councils. And in fact, I think there's only a handful of councils across the state, certainly the rural ones, who haven't signed up to that. So we're actually in the middle of this project looking at electric vehicle charging infrastructure across the state. Separately, there's all the different Greenhouse Alliances got together, and there's an alliance of alliances, if you can believe it, but they got together and they have a conference every year, the Greenhouse Alliances, and it's fantastic. It's information really targeted to specifically climate change things, runs for a day, and it's incredibly valuable information sharing. And they've also started a project looking at a 10-year power purchasing agreement for electricity. So a number of councils have got together to buy 100% renewables, or a portion thereof, for the council's electricity consumption for 10 years to sign up, and we're putting it out to market. And by combining together, we've got a much bigger bargaining power, and we can potentially get a much better deal and go out to the market and see what we can get in terms of a 10-year deal for renewable energy. So I think there's quite a bit of action already happening, but there's always going to be more that we could do.
And that's all for this episode of Emerging Sustainably. The 2019 Emerging Leaders Program participants would like to thank LGPro for their support and for making their offices available for the recording of this podcast. A big thank you to the Victorian Student Representative Council, Sustainability Victoria, and all our guests for donating their time and insights. If you'd like to learn more about what your council is doing to plan for a more sustainable future, we encourage you to reach out to your local government sustainability officer.